Greetings, everybody. I'm Will Tagle, and this is our webinar on the great books. And we welcome you today in various forms of participating. We have this particular week, we have an Earth Tribe Immersion is one of the Wisdom School courses that's being offered, and so we have some participants here live with us from that, and we'll hear from some of them, all of them, next at the conclusion of what I have to say. So I'm going to talk for a few minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for discussion. Also, I want to encourage you to go down to the bottom of your screen and click on chat, as Myra Jackson has already, and carry on your responses in the chat box, and we'll proceed from there. Also, this will give us a background for what I have to say today. Okay, so away we go. Come with me on a brief link from our last book that Jim did so well to Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. Something was off-putting for me as I read Plutarch's Lives, The Life of Alexander. Though I gave the book my attentive respect, of course, it stood the test of time. And yet it gave me a sick feeling in my stomach. It was a similar feeling I had when I first read the Iliad and the Aeneid, epic myths of war and violence. Classics, yes, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong with the lens these classics offered. It was a similar feeling I had as a boy with Germany's Blitzkrieg, with Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and later in 2003 with a preemptive shock and awe invasion of Iraq. The feeling of unease increased and pushed me to delve deeper into Alexander's life, even beyond Plutarch's rendering. All the while, I wrote on my notes on Rachel Carson for this webinar. And the contrast was staggering. And we like to do that in the Wisdom School. We like to bring different energetic points of view, bringing opposites together. And this was really that. Alexander, we are told, slept with the Iliad under his pillow, calling Homer's tale his, quote, journey book of excellence in war. Next to his book of war, he kept a dagger under his pillow. Various sources indicated that Alexander and his soldiers were inspired to kill hundreds of thousands of people. In a drunken rage, he personally used the dagger under his pillow to kill a friend. One historian observed that he abused both alcohol and opium. That was one side of Alexander, one I would hesitate to call great. On the other side of his inner council of selves sat a student of Aristotle with particular attention to the Nicomachean ethics, which, as you know, points us toward a state of happiness. Aristotle's word for happiness, eudaimonia, which can be translated as flourishing or thriving by developing virtue. As a student of Aristotle, Alexander was steeped in such ethics. He also, surprisingly, was a healer. He was well known for his use of plants to heal his wounded soldiers. When this side of Alexander had the inner microphone, he could have been great indeed. He had the potential of integrating warrior and healer, and of becoming a truly great philosopher king. But did he make it? The most intense war that Alexander fought was between these opposites inside himself. On the one hand, you had a warrior who didn't hesitate to preside over what I would call a genocidal conquering of the known world. I propose that these massive killings plunged him into a spiritual and emotional crisis and sent him into a spiral of self-medications through alcohol and opium. And this addictive urge eventually dominated him. Still, as I moved deeper into his life and beyond my feelings of unease, I found myself in a state of deep compassion for this young man whose brain was not fully developed when he invaded Persia at the age of 22. Here was an adolescent split into two warring parts: the drug abusive but brilliant warrior and the virtuous healer. He died, as Jim told us last month, in what I would call a victim of his own inner war. Alexander's legacy for us: a respected military handbook of war, the foundation of the patriarchy we have today, and an opioid epidemic. From the viewpoint of the Book of Hopi, let's reach back a few months to another great book. From that viewpoint, Alexander and the Greeks are important to understand because they built a bridge from the third world or civilization to the fourth. Alexander, Aristotle, Plato, Abraham, the Apostle Paul, Buddha, and Mohammed all ushered in the fourth world. And notice, they were all men. They brought us a civilization that reached its apex in Leonardo and Michelangelo. Their works of art and the accomplishments of the ensuing science were so glittering that we moderns were distracted from the widening gap between us as humans and our habitat. Then, as this gap between us and our habitat gapped open into a chasm miles deep and miles wide, Western civilization began its long descent into a destructive patriarchy, so evident today. Perhaps the Greeks were necessary in the evolutionary narrative to balance out a long reign of the matriarchy that preceded the Greeks and the Abrahamic religions. But we don't know, do we? Because so far our current human story is dominated with the arrogance of both a patriarchal biblical literalism and a male-dominated and mechanistic science. Through it all, we have been seduced by a perverted objectivity that assumes the current generation is the most advanced. We humans have been devastated by this one fallacy. After this, therefore, better than this. The result, as humans lost in the patriarchy, we have raped our planet, and the offspring of this rape is a devastating climate change, the preeminent issue of our day. In this fourth civilization, we have a severe split in the United States and really throughout all mainstream civilization. Democrats and Republicans don't reach across to each other because they can't. And as Jim pointed out last month, Donald Trump is not an anomaly who deviates from an otherwise okay standard. He is our standard, if in exaggerated form. Or rather, his archetype makes explicit a patriarchy that was founded on the split, so evident in Alexander III of Macedonia and his teacher, Aristotle. In case I have not been clear, here's the current global civilizational split. Humans are over here, splitting ourselves off to observe nature over there. In which case, nature becomes the object of our observation. Looking through such a lens, humans are the dominant force, the apex of creation, in which we are free to do whatever we want with the natural order. Nature in the patriarchal paradigm is at best a tool for our own pleasure and advance. The best that this paradigm has to offer is that we are called to be the stewards of the fields. But even then, we, like Alexander, are split inside ourselves and thus project that split all around us into the natural world. And in this way, mainline culture is inevitably schizophrenogenic. But don't jump to conclusions here. Western civilization has contributed much of value, including the stunning works of the architects of our historic culture I just mentioned. But no matter what benefits, and indeed beauty that its artists, scientists, and philosophers have given us, we still find ourselves at the end of a rope. Our current version of culture has trapped us in what Jean-Paul Sartre calls no exit. The patriarchy has given us a lens to look at reality. And no matter what we do, no matter how advanced we are with our technology, if we look through the lens of human exceptionalism, we are still hopelessly split. At least that was the case until a voice began crying in and for the wilderness, the voice of a little girl who became a woman, who dared to challenge the giants of a 5,000-year-old patriarchy. Her name, Rachel Carson. First, let's lay the groundwork for her monumental book, Silent Spring, by looking at how a small farm near the confluence of a once pristine stream called Riddle Run and the Allegheny River gave birth to the modern environmental movement. Rachel's hometown of Springdale, Pennsylvania, population about 3,000, is located at this confluence about 18 miles northeast of Pittsburgh. The Allegheny derives its name from an ancient people, and the name itself means beautiful flowing river. During Rachel Carson's early childhood, the Allegheny had lost much of its beauty, but the stream not far from where she lived, which was called Riddle Run, still flowed with beauty. Let's just pause for a moment and take a look at this stream from a photo taken about the time Rachel was growing up. So just take that in for a moment. In other teachings, I propose that a glacier lake near Bern, Switzerland, gave birth to the special theory of relativity through Albert Einstein, as he put his feet in the icy water and then warmed to a fire on a rocky beach with his friends. In a similar vein, I suggest that this stream and small farm gave birth to the modern environmental movement through Rachel Carson, who, as you can see, is the daughter of this eco field. Before we go on to the next comment, Dan, see if you can bring up the picture of Rachel sitting in the field with her dog. I just want us to take in this possibility that as Rachel connected deeply in her elementary age years with the stream and with the field and with the dog, that somehow this deep connection she made was an important part of her birthing and of her becoming who she was. But as Rachel moved into middle and high school, the streams and rivers of her early childhood turned dark with pollution. By the time she was in high school, the coal and oil industries moved more fully into her landscape. Some people say that more money has been made out of the Pittsburgh coal seam than any other mineral deposit in the history of the world. In 1859, the first oil well in the US was drilled not far from Rachel's home. And that is where we humans took a very dark turn, literally dark. Dark as in oil, dark as in coal. We humans just thought we could do whatever we wanted with the eco fields without considering at all the consequences. The result of this dark turn is described by R.L. Duffus in the American Monthly, quote, "From whatever direction one approaches the once lovely conjunction of the Allegheny and Riddle Run, the devastation of progress is everywhere apparent. Quiet valleys have become inundated with slag, defaced with refuse, marred by hideous buildings. Streams have been polluted with sewage and waste from the mills. Life for the majority of the population has been rendered unspeakably pinched and dingy. This is what we might be calling the technological blight of our civilization. The inability of the state of Pennsylvania to force Pittsburgh to treat its sewage during Rachel's later childhood meant that the city disgorged its raw sewage into the rivers. The grotesque pollution continued until 1958, when Rachel began writing the book we are considering, Silent Spring. The beauty of the early eco field of Rachel's childhood and the devastation of her later childhood combined to birth a new Rachel, a woman, a substantial woman who would be a gate opener to the bridge leading to a new and potentially regenerative civilization. Her anger at lost beauty, her anger at her lost stream, her anger at the devastation of the field where she sat with her dog, fueled her to larger possibilities. You see, my background story about her book, Silent Spring, leads not to dystopia, not to hopelessness, but to a bridge that can lead us to a new day. And the gate to that bridge was opened by none other than the beautiful little girl sitting in the field with her dog. But I get ahead of my story. Let's move now to my second point. Let's consider now how Rachel is the wave action of a coming tsunami of the divine feminine. The U.S. women's movement had its beginning in 1848 when Elizabeth Stanton and Lucretia Mott convened the Seneca Falls Convention in New York to, quote, discuss the social, civil, and religious condition and rights of women. That was the first wave of the divine feminine, of the return of the Great Mother. 20 years later, at the American Anti-Slavery Society meeting in Boston, abolitionist Lucy Stone and suffragist Susan B. Anthony took human rights further by proposing a new organization where women and African Americans could become Americans, could work together toward universal suffrage. That was the second wave. 50 years of struggle later, the 19th Amendment was ratified on August the 26th, 1920, and women's suffrage was achieved. That is, white women's suffrage was achieved. That was the third wave. My mother, Juanita Stevens, was a fierce advocate of the rights of women. She reminded me that the 19th Amendment was passed on August the 26th, my birthday, just 20 years before I was born. She reminded me that I should never forget that her mother could vote, that my mother could vote only 20 years before I was born. Because of that shared birthday, I soon got caught up in the coming tsunami. Through my mother's inspiration, I was encouraged to study with a close friend of Gandhi's who taught me about the rights of those who had been colonized. My mother's inspiration connected me with Dr. Martin Luther King's civil rights movement and aimed me at working for human minorities. But something was missing. All of these movements of women's rights and human rights were just that, human-centered rights. That is, until Riddle's Run and the Allegheny River bottoms gave birth to Rachel Carson. With her, the surge of the tsunami of the divine feminine roared onto the seashore. Through the sea around us, Rachel Carson proclaimed that there are no human rights apart from the rights of more than human components of nature. all human rights are a subset of nature's rights. And Rachel Carson was the first human to connect the rights of women with the rights of nature. And herein lies our hope for Earth's new era. Not Gandhi, not Martin Luther King, not Susan B. Anthony. None of these great people saw this vital link. Only Rachel Carson saw that all human rights are nested in the holarchy of nature's rights. That is why she is one of the greats of the modern era. Overlooked? Yes, but still a giant. How did Rachel's life unfold into this auspicious place? That brings me to a third point, Rachel Carson's professional development. She studied English literature and journalism in an out-of-the-way college, a small college, long way from the Ivy League. Along the way, she shifted her major from English literature to marine biology. Her family was economically stressed, so she worked to pay her own way, clawing her way finally into Johns Hopkins master's program, where she excelled. Keep in mind, this was a time when college advisors told women that their only future in science would be as librarians. Still, she persevered. Just as she was poised to enter a PhD program, her father died, and she became the sole support of her mother and her siblings. A PhD was now economically out of sight. She began her professional career as a master's level aquatic biologist in the U.S. Bureau of Fisheries, which was at least a tiny bit more flexible than male-dominated academia. But even there, her male superiors at first delegated her to writing marketing text, a proper place for a woman not deemed worthy of serious research. Here again, she was like Einstein, who himself could not make it in a prestigious academic setting, but rather thrived as an out-of-the-way patent clerk. Rachel Carson also thrived, get this, in writing radio copy for a series of weekly educational broadcasts entitled Romance Under the Water. The series of 52 7-minute programs focused on aquatic life and was intended to generate public interest in fish biology and in the work of the Bureau. This was a task that several writers before Carson had not managed. But Carson's supervisor, pleased with the success of the radio series, asked her to write the introduction to a public brochure about the Fisheries Bureau. He also worked to secure her the first full-time position that became available. Sitting for the civil service exam to get the job, she outscored all the other applicants. And in 1936, she became only the second woman ever hired by the Bureau of Fisheries for a full-time position. Her title was Junior Aquatic Biologist. They didn't know they had let loose a tiger in their quiet living room. Finally, she had a male superior who saw her brilliance in the integration of science and writing. Completely bowled over by the power of one of her brochures. Now, get this. She's, at this point, not writing in serious domain. She's writing marketing brochures. And this one was called The World of Waters. And because of this, he encouraged her to write for a larger audience. The essay was published as Undersea, and it was a vivid narrative of a journey along the ocean floor. It marked a major turning point in her writing career. Soon, the publishing house of Simon & Schuster, impressed by the brochure, contacted Rachel and suggested that she expand it into a book. Several years of writing resulted in the book Under the Sea Wind, which received excellent reviews, but didn't sell all that well. I can identify with that. Encouraged by this modest success, she attempted to leave the confines of the Bureau. But most of the science money, let's get this now, most of the science money at that time was going where? It was going into the Manhattan Project and its development of the atomic bomb. In 1945, she had been promoted at last to chief researcher. And such research brought her keen eye to a new and miracle chemical called DDT. It was nicknamed the insect bomb, actually named after the atomic bomb. She immediately saw that DDT posed an ecological threat, maybe the equal of nuclear bombs. She filed away that troublesome piece of data as she dived into writing another book on another subject called The Sea Around Us. The Sea Around Us remained on the New York Times bestseller list for 86 weeks, was abridged by Reader's Digest, won the 1952 National Book Award for nonfiction, and resulted in Rachel Carson's being awarded 2 honorary doctorates. At last, she was called Dr. Carson. She also licensed a documentary film based on the book. With success of bestsellers came at last to the poverty-stricken little girl who was now a successful woman, financial security. And in 1952, Rachel Carson at last was able to give up her job in order to concentrate on writing full time. And that brings me to my 4th point. Our great book, Silent Spring. In the 1940s, DDT, the insect bomb, was introduced all over the United States for the so-called control of mosquitoes and other insects. Many of us recall DDT fogging of our neighborhoods in the summertime. As children of the 1940s, my friends and I followed the fogging machines around on our bicycles, breathing in the deadly chemical. 10 years later, by 1957, my junior year in high school, the United States government had expanded DDT into aerial spraying of crops. The government mixed the chemical. Now get this. The government mixed the chemical with fuel oil so it would stick on whatever it hit. And yes, it did stick on our skins as children. It's a wonder we're as healthy as we are. Science then, as now, was divided into two sides. One side defended the chemical companies and denied any problem with spraying. Rachel Carson fast became a powerful voice for the side that saw clearly the devastating harm of the chemicals. These scientists vigorously advocated for more natural approaches to the balance of insects with crops. The whole controversy got my adolescent attention when the government at last listened to Rachel's barrage of scientific articles. She had moved from brochures to serious scientific writing. This was the year of the great cranberry scandal. The 1958 crop of United States cranberries were found to contain high levels of the herbicide aminotriazolate, a chemical which caused cancer in laboratory rats. Shockingly, the sale of all cranberry products was halted. It made for no cranberries at Thanksgiving or Christmas. This was an odd happening that gained even the attention of an adolescent, such as myself. Curiosity about the cranberry scandal was my first contact with the prophet scientist who dared invade our Christmas dinner. Rachel was hot on the trail of something big, and big business was beginning to take notice. Little did they know what this unheralded woman was about to unleash on them. By 1960, Rachel Carson had more than enough research material, and her writing was progressing rapidly on her masterpiece. In addition to the thorough literary research that she had done, she had investigated personally hundreds of individual incidents of pesticide exposure and the human sickness and ecological damage that resulted. Silent Spring was progressing. However, in January of 1961, a duodenal ulcer followed by several infections kept her bedridden for weeks, greatly delaying the completion of her masterpiece. She was nearing full recovery in March, when one day in the shower, she discovered cysts on her left breast, one of which eventually necessitated a mastectomy. Her personal discovery of cancer happened just as she was completing the drafts of 2 chapters of the book we are reading, On Cancer. Though her doctor described the procedure as precautionary and recommended no further treatment, by December of that same year, Rachel Carson discovered that the tumor was in fact malignant and that the cancer had metastasized. Still, she persisted. She persisted as if the life of Earth depended on the writing of this book. It was difficult finding a title. Silent Spring was initially suggested as a title for the chapter on birds. But by August of 1961, Rachel finally agreed to the suggestion of her literary agent, Marie Rodell, that Silent Spring would be a metaphorical title for the entire book. The book title dramatically suggested what? A bleak future for the whole natural world unless something was done, and done quickly. Incredibly, Rachel Carson anticipated climate change 44 years before Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth. Though Silent Spring had generated a fairly high level of interest based on pre-publication promotion, the buzz became much more intense with the serialization in the New Yorker magazine. This brought the book to the attention, as you might guess, of the chemical industry and its lobbyists, but also to a wide swath of the American populace. By the time I arrived at Emory University in the fall of that year, where I was to study for a master's degree, her book was already the rage of the campus. In the weeks leading up to the publication, there was strong opposition from the chemical industry. DuPont, which was a main manufacturer of DDT, and Velsicol Chemical Company, which was the exclusive manufacturer of Chlordane, were among the first to respond. DuPont compiled an extensive report on the book's press coverage and estimated its impact on public opinion. Velsicol threatened legal action against Houghton Mifflin, the publishers, as well as the New Yorker magazine, unless the planned publishing of Silent Spring was canceled. The chemical industry representatives and lobbyists also lodged a range of non-specific complaints, mostly anonymous. Chemical companies and associated organizations produced a number of their own brochures and articles promoting and defending the use of pesticides as being in the best interest of our health. However, Rachel and her publishers were confident in the vetting process Silent Spring had undergone. The magazine and book publications proceeded as planned, as did the large Book of the Month printing, which, by the way, included a pamphlet endorsement by the Supreme Court Justice, William O. Douglas. Would that we had more of his kind. In one of her last public appearances, Carson testified before President John F. Kennedy. His committee issued its report on May 15th of 1963, backing Rachel Carson's scientific claims. Following the report's release, Rachel came before the United States Senate subcommittee to make policy recommendations. Before I complete my story of this day, I want to turn very briefly to Rachel Carson's story, or fable, that introduces her book. She called it A Fable for Tomorrow. The enchantment and wisdom of her story are worth our further attention, even though you likely have read it, and maybe you've read it many times. She begins, there was once a town in the heart of America where all life seemed to live in harmony with its surrounding. Here you have the masthead of what lies on the other side of the bridge, leading us from the patriarchy of Western civilization to Earth's new era. Here is that masthead, where all life seemed to live in harmony with its surroundings. Then she wrote, in autumn, oak and maple and birch set up a blaze of color that flamed and flickered across a backdrop of pines. Then foxes barked in the hills and deer silently crossed the fields, half hidden in the mists of fall mornings. Later on, in her book, it is easy to get lost in the exploration of the science of man-made chemicals which end up coursing through our bodies. But in the beginning, she connects us with beauty, with the beauty of what we could lose unless we move. The countryside was, in fact, she said, famous for the abundance and variety of bird life. And listen to this. And when the flood of migrants was pouring through in spring and fall, people traveled great distance to observe and be with the birds. And then she gets to the heart of her book, the heart which tells us how to read the rest of the book. A strange blight crept over the area, and everything began to change this beauty. Some evil spell had settled on the community. Mysterious maladies swept the flocks of chicken. The cattle and sheep sickened and died. Everywhere was the shadow of death. There had been several sudden and unexplained deaths, not only among adults, but especially among children, who would be stricken suddenly while at play, and they would die within hours. So it was that soon after these words were written, Rachel Carson discovered she had cancer. As I mentioned, she herself died shortly after The Silent Spring was published, just as her fable had predicted. Sad, yes. Tragic, to be sure. But recall for a moment the little girl sitting in the field with her dog. She was awakened by the glories of the stream by her house. Then she railed against the men of the academy. She railed against the temples of power. The corporate giants sought to crucify her. And with her dying, they thought they had. But alas, out of her crucifixion came a resurrection of nature itself. A resurrection that opened the door for the connection to the wild heart, that energetic core of nature beyond the control of humans. And after a period of time, a great environmental following arose, remnants of humans indebted to Rachel Carson's birthing. They, dare I say, we speak in an unknown tongue that sounds like the barking of foxes in eco fields half hidden in the mists of spring mornings. Next month, I will go much deeper into Silent Spring itself and its very confronting text. I will also talk about the inherent hope. And relevant to our study, I will offer what I think makes such a great book truly great. So I've left amount of time for us to discuss. So I want to go to Angie Azur. And Angie, get your response this morning. Hey, Angie.
How are you? I love to talk. So I'm actually amazed at your passion for this. It makes perfect sense to me that you would be the perfect teacher for this book. when I was reading this book, I cried multiple times. My husband kept saying, "What are you doing to yourself?" I was like, I'm just so sad for nature. We continue to think that we are above it. And I don't understand this strange, odd way of thinking. We are all made from the same elements, that everybody is made from the same things. We can only be made from what's on the earth. So I don't understand how we think that we are above it and that the poisons we are creating won't affect us, either now or down the line, our children and what we're doing to the earth. So yeah, I'm really saddened by this book, but I have hope because I grew up in Pittsburgh, PA, and we were told when I was really young not to go into the Allegheny River because there was sewage. And people weren't on the river and weren't on the beaches and rock beaches there. And fish were dying. My grandmother used to say that she could see to the bottom of the river when she was young, but it was so dirty now that the fish were dead. There were no birds. But today, the Allegheny River has the big birds back, has fish back. People are actually there fishing. They're on the river in their boats. People are, doing that behind the boat skiing. I don't do that, so I forget what the name of that is. But and it's back to being beautiful. So I think Rachel's amazing, and I think your talk on her today was really passionate, really full of heart, and I loved how you connected the past book that we read about Caesar and Rachel. So great job, loved it.
Yeah. Listen, let's pause for just a second because you're a wonderful commentator here because in your grandmother must have been about the age of Rachel Carson.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And in that one generation, we went from your grandmother being able to look into the Allegheny, which means beautiful flowing river, and she could actually look through clear water. And then during her lifetime and yours, it became so polluted you couldn't go into the water.
Totally. There were jokes about sewage floating by if you took a boat out into the water and not eating any of the fish and them being poisoned, and you wouldn't want to go near the water. And I just remember thinking, it's so sad because the water in Pittsburgh, there are 3 rivers. Well, actually, there's 4 rivers. People don't know about the one underground. And they surround the city, and it just brings such joy and love to drive across the bridges and see the water and see the river. And as I was growing up and not being allowed to go near it or use it just seemed strange. I was little, so it wasn't like a big deal in my heart then. But as I'm reading this book and realizing I grew really close to Rachel, and I also found seashells. I grew up in a blueberry farm back east, and I also found seashells in our blueberry farm, like she found seashells, and was curious about marine biology and how, where the oceans receded. It was just really interesting how similar her and I grew up. And not being able to use those waterways when I was little really makes me sad now, and things that I missed out on and my whole generation missed out on back then.
Right. And completing the circle now, you're saying that the Allegheny, because of her work and the work of the environmental movement, there's been some breakthroughs in the Allegheny.
Yeah, we have bald eagles back now. So that's a huge thing. You can actually go and watch them. There are multiple birds that fish out of the Allegheny now. People are down there in their big suits walking out into the water fishing. People are in their boats. It's very different. You can go out and watch the fireworks on 4th of July on your boat. There's no strange smells, no sewage. Yeah, she really changed it for the better and makes me happy.
Yeah. And in that way, we're actually some remnants are on the bridge going into the new era. There are overlapping eras that we're experiencing here.
Yeah, there really are. There's hope.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your comments. So I want to shift now to Jen Sundin. So just giving you a background here, we're having this week the Wisdom School and the Earth Wisdom Academy sponsor an independent study called Earth Tribe Immersion. So we have several people here in our little valley immersing themselves in the eco fields of the Earth Tribe. And Jennifer Sundin from Boston area is here with us. So, hi, Jennifer.
Well, thank you for inviting me here this morning. It's great to be back in Wimberley. So thank you, Will, for educating us this morning and for, again, your passion and your compassion. And I want to this morning, if it's okay, to take 5 or 6 minutes and kind of braid together your comments this morning about Homer and about Rachel Carson herself, and really the third strand is the plight of humanity. And I'm leading next month a goddess pilgrimage to Sicily, where the temples of Demeter and Persephone are. And Homer, you know, he's perhaps in a sense like Alexander the Great in that there's a duality there, a huge contrast between the Iliad and that, you know, the book of war, and a profound poem he wrote called The Hymn to Demeter. And in fact, it's been proposed or suggested that this beautiful hymn might have in fact been penned by a woman, only because it speaks so much to the matriarch and to the plight of women back then. I almost think that this hymn, this poem, it was almost like it was written for us now, and it really parallels Silent Spring. So I just wanted to quickly kind of summarize the poem for everyone, and I'll try to be super quick, but once upon a time, a long time ago, there lived the goddess Demeter, the goddess of the grain. She was very much a Mother Earth goddess, like Gaia, like Inanna. And she had her beloved daughter, Kore, and they were fast and furious friends, not just mother-daughter, but their bond was just truly inseparable. And Kore spent her years wandering the meadows with her mother and her maiden friends. And there came a time where she was wandering in a meadow, and I have 3 teenage daughters, so I can relate to this. She was very kind of self-absorbed in her moment and just, you know, in love with the meadow and the flowers, and she had her maiden friends kind of off in the meadow as well. And she leaned down and she saw a narcissus. Unbeknownst to her, her father, Zeus, and the male gods had kind of pre-planned a wedding of Kore and Hades, the god of the underworld. Demeter, her mother, had no idea that this was to happen, but as Kore leaned down and plucked the narcissus, a chasm 100 miles wide and 100 miles deep opened up, and she was taken. She fell down into the depths, down to Hades. There she, and this is symbolizing, there's many, many layers to this, but in essence, really it's symbolizing the rape of the patriarch of the matriarch. And so she falls down and is confined to hell, you know, in essence. And she is there with the dead, and she mourns, the separation of her mother. And she mourns her entrapment. And she spends time there, really in this deep place of loss of what used to be. In the meantime, Demeter, her mother, is utterly distraught. She calls and calls for her daughter and cannot find her. For 9 days she roams, representing the 9 days or the 9 months of pregnancy. Demeter roams the earth looking for her daughter, and she calls upon the gods, and they kind of, turn their heads. They know full well what happened, but they don't aid her by any means. So as Demeter mourns her daughter, the goddess of the land, the goddess of the harvest, the plants begin to wither, and the earth dries up, and the storms come and the tides rise, and Demeter is in such a deep place of mourning. Her little girl is gone. And so the poem leads to really Demeter's journey, and maybe that's another discussion for another time. But essentially, she in the land of Eleusis, she is welcomed by women, by mothers and grandmothers and daughters, and she's really taken into this place and befriended. And she's there in her deep mourning, but the women don't ask. The women just embrace. And Demeter has her journey. The earth is in trouble at this point, and the gods, Zeus and the other gods, kind of selfishly realize at this point something needs to be done, because the people aren't there. They're hungry. They're dying. They aren't able to perform the rites and the sacrifices and the prayer. And so eventually he relents, and he sends Hermes down to Hades and says, we must free Kore, and we must allow her to come back and see her mother. So at this point, she receives the news from Hades, and we don't know. She opens her mouth, whether in delight or shock or something. She opens her mouth, and Hades places 6 pomegranate seeds in her mouth. And the pomegranate, the name in Greek is kokos, which actually you can imagine it is an egg in a sense, but the word kokos, the seedlings that are inside the pomegranate, it actually is another word for testicle. So what I find really interesting is that she had a choice at that moment. She could have played out the part of being a victim, a recipient of some severe trauma. She could have spit out the seeds, she had choices. And in that moment, I feel like she decided to ingest the whole, her trauma and everything that had just happened to her, the male and the female. And in doing so, she was given freedom. And so she returned to her mother. And she returned in springtime and renamed Persephone. And for the first time in the poem, she speaks, and she's no longer silent. Mm-hmm. So I feel like this poem, very quickly to summarize, really speaks to our plight now, and that, the chasm has opened, and that, we have a choice. We can point fingers, we can be the victims, or we can kind of take our responsibility, that humans have done this, and we have a choice to kind of move onward and find our voice and find power in that voice, and kind of rebirth ourselves, and let springtime happen again. So that's my kind of long take on that. But it's worthy, the hymn.
Thank you so much. And I think in the future we can go into that more, but I think it gives us that other side of Homer, that is the tension between opposites that we're seeing. It seems to be a part of the human awareness, consciousness condition. So Amy Blumenshine, so let's get your take on this.
That's great, but I actually have heard what Mike is going to talk about. May he speak first?
Well, thank you, Will, and Angie and Jen for creating such a amazingly rich container for today. I just wanted to react quickly to what Rachel Carson meant to me 40 years ago when I first encountered her, and again today as I recently re-listened to to her story. Like many others in the late 1960s, I was very inspired by her words. Her words helped stimulate mine and hundreds of thousands of others in the activities of the original Earth Day in 1970, and then the follow-up environmental struggles of the 1970s and beyond. I grew up across the state from Angie in eastern Pennsylvania, and like Angie, I could not swim in our local river because it was filled with battery acid and coal dust. But Rachel's words were impressive on so many levels. Here she was, a woman in a very male-dominated world of science, and she had this incredible gift, as you described, Will, with words, with meticulous research, and an ability to integrate all this knowledge in a way that disrupted the industrial chemical complex of that day and continuing today. So as I jump ahead to today and my recent hearing of her words, I have been so moved by how she so effectively moves between what we might call the microcosm and the macrocosm. She goes into exquisite detail about cell science and understanding the impact of particular pesticides. And as you indicated, well, hundreds of incidents of different chemicals and their impact on cell division and cell reproduction, what this meant to plant life, animal life, and human life. And as she considered this, she also looked at the life cycles and the impact of these chemicals on birds, on animals, and as they impacted each other, and carried this to macro levels, looking at soil system, watersheds, food distribution systems, forests. She could look so well and understand so well the big impact on what now we would call ecofields, and how humans, plants, animals, and other aspects of nature interact. She exhibits, I think, in this book, a high degree of consciousness and perception about how, as humans, we are capable of having such dramatic impacts. In fact, to the point that we can destroy ecofields and ecosystems. And I'm struck with, I guess, the two messages I take away today is her sense of humility, of how we need to be humble about our role in the natural world, and how she contrasts that with the arrogance of those who thinks we can control nature and exploit it in whatever method we want to. She talks about the superhighway to destruction. But at the same time, she, as others here have pointed out, is a word of hope. And I think she continues for all of us who hear her words to be engaged, a call to action, to work together to challenge industry and to create a world where we indeed live in harmony with the creation we are blessed with. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. I think when I have Amy come to this other microphone.
Well, thank you for this opportunity. And I want to thank Mike for his activism, especially on the original Earth Day in 1970, because Rachel Carson was not there to make things happen. Activists make things happen. And of course, now we have the Environmental Protection Agency, and it's time to speak against the atrocity of Scott Pruitt, working against those the progress that was made in terms of our efforts to implement our knowledge, our science-based knowledge about what we need to do to protect our environment for future generations. So we all have a role to play. April 22nd is Earth Day, and please be active in your locale, which is now worldwide, by the way. Earth Days has gone worldwide. I think overall our society is in this process of the challenge of growing out of adolescence, where we have chosen immediate gratification over paying attention to the consequences of our behavior. And we really do need to grow along from this process before we destroy ourselves. Rachel has these great quotes, like she talks about the little tranquilizing pills of half-truths that we're fed, justifying our current status quo, and talks about how we've fallen into a mesmerizing trance, which other people call a consensus trance, and how we don't pay attention to those things that are most important for us to pay attention to. Now, as I read Rachel Carson today, and thank you very much, Will, for drawing the connection with Alexander, I make an immediate association between the harm caused by the weapons in the war against nature and our current military wars of choice over whatever current enemy. And even as it's so incredible that chemical weapons that were created for our war were the first chemical fertilizers, or I guess pesticides and fertilizers too, that we are also all impacted by the cancerous radiation that came out of use of our chase after the ultimate potency of nuclear weapons, the power to dominate completely. And we know that part of what is going on is the turning of one's own biology against oneself, which is going on in cancer. Rachel talks about how we've put weapons in the hands of people who are totally ignorant of their harm. And we see the use of lethal violence done with seeming carelessness. We talk about the agents of death that we use against the plant world and the impetuous and heedless pace of man. Again, I'm quoting from Rachel. And this incapacity to see how what we were doing in dumping toxins and explosives in great numbers on people at a distance from us are actually coming back to hurt us. And I remind us of the flu epidemic that came out of the conditions and secrecy of World War I. So let us wake up from our disassociation with what really matters and cherish life in a way that we use our science and our knowledge to stop killing ourselves as we try to kill others. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amy. So lest we get trapped in the Western Hemisphere, I want to go over to Georgie and get your response, Georgie, to Rachel Carson and the flowing dialogue we're having here.
Thank you, Will. First, gratitude to you. You are always so amazing. I really enjoyed every second of your lecture. Thank you so much. And it was also really wonderful to see Sheila's face a little bit just a few minutes ago. So she's there, her energy is there, wonderful. And I also enjoyed so much corresponding with Ruth and Angie and Myra, or Mira, sorry if I don't pronounce your name very correctly. Especially Angie's last message. I think all those questions she posed deserves a whole lecture. So maybe we can design a good workshop around it. But going back to your topic, I think Rachel's book is just as important now as it was when she published it 40 years ago. I was a little girl growing up in Hungary, and I did experience chemicals around me in nature, but maybe not as much as you did in the States. Hungary is a smaller country. There was communism at that time. But I think the mindset was just as much prevalent as it was 40 years ago and as it is now, mastering nature. And there was a question just some time ago that where does this come from? There is that feeling superior to each other and to nature. Where does that stem from? I believe it inferior, because we know in our heart and soul that we are inferior. Why do we need to feel that way? Why can't we just feel that we are equal part of nature, not above, not below, but equal? And let's act, live, and think that way. There are many things actually grabbed me from Rachel's book, and two of which these are the guiding metaphors I would like to share with you and almost quickly pass on the walking stick to my dear colleagues Jim and Mark to leave sufficient time for their contribution. But let me just share these two very short sentences. This is what Rachel said. System relationship between living things cannot be safely ignored any more than the law of gravity. How true. And also, ecological web of life bind together organisms and their environment so that even minor changes in one area reverberate over space and time. Absolutely. I think her greatest message is that how human health and the health of nature are so interdependent and interlinked. And we are so blind, not noticing it. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Georgie. So let's go over to Jim Garrison now.
Hi, Will. Hi, everyone. And Will, let me just say, that was brilliant. And the profundity to me about what Will just delivered to us was the stark juxtaposition of greatness. The greatness of Alexander the Great and the greatness of Rachel Carlson, from the perspective that the greatness of Rachel Carlson casts such a penetrating shadow on the greatness of Alexander that the greatness of Alexander dissolves away, and he becomes how Will described him, actually a tortured, split personality that wrought great violence on fellow human beings. And we can see that now only because Rachel Carlson has emerged and redefined our notion of greatness. And so I really want to thank you for that. And I would make two very brief comments. One, to refer back to Homer, and I may take up Homer next year. Just to point out, since Jen talked about the myth of Demeter and Persephone, you know, Homer's story of Demeter is the only example in Greek mythology where one of the gods demonstrated grief. And that's just worth thinking about. It's also worth thinking about that when Homer wrote the Iliad, he didn't describe the Trojan War. He described one small fractal. The great epic poem starts, "Sing, O Muse, of the wrath of Achilles." And what Homer does through the Iliad is show how the wrath of Achilles both consumed Achilles, but transformed Achilles so that by the end of the Iliad, Achilles has become an aware human being. And so Homer and the greatness of the Iliad and the Demeter were playing on issues that were very, very deep and are well worth deeper exploration. And maybe next year somebody can do the myth of Demeter, and we can juxtapose them in a trimester, and I can do the Iliad, and then we can do the poem of Demeter. Is just a contrast, which leads me to the second point, and that is that the juxtaposition that you were making between the greatness then and the greatness now, and patriarchy and now matriarchy, and domination, and now alignment with the larger eco field, seems so obvious, and we all are proud to call ourselves environmentalists. But I would make the point, as many of you students and faculty know that I make, we still have yet to take on what I believe to be the greatest challenge of our generation, and that is our own religious traditions. I believe that it's not until we conceive, like juxtaposing Rachel and Alexander, juxtaposing the emergence of this new spirituality and the complete poverty of Judaism and Christianity and Islam and Buddhism and Hinduism and Confucianism, against the backdrop of everything that we need now to become. And I would insert into this discussion, and I will be taking this up when we get to Nietzsche, that nothing short of a radical break, like Will just did between Alexander, the so-called great, and Rachel Carlson, the really great, and define who we are by equally, clearly defining who we are not. And doing it not only in terms of our relationship with the earth, but our relationship to God, our relationship to the cosmos, our relationship ultimately to ourselves, that we really will get to the yonder shore. And once we're there on the yonder shore, we will look back. And that's why I say that even if we have to urgently transcend fossil fuels for alternative energy and clean technology and a new relationship with nature, we also just as radically and just as urgently need to transcend our entire metaphysical and religious traditions and embrace a whole new way of being in the world and understanding ourselves in relationship to the larger cosmos. So I hats off to you, Will. You did it. You did it, man. And opened up what I believe to be the real conversation that we human beings now have to have on this planet to save ourselves.
Well, thank you, Jim. And this is a rich conversation, and that brings us to Mark Ryan. My guess is you have your perspective on this, Mark. We're ready to hear.
Oh, well, you have a tendency to put me in that role, and I try not to disappoint you this time. First of all, thank you for this beautifully powerful presentation. I had the same memories you have about following the DDT cloud going through the neighborhood on my bicycle with my dog Abraham, and also that epoch of Cold War mentality, where there was a war. I remember a documentary on basically insects versus humans in a battle for life. And I had no idea what this thing was called, but I remember it vividly, and it was really, it was part of the Cold War ethos of the time, I think, to see things in terms of those radical distinctions, radical opposition. Maybe that has given me some caution about going too quick to radical opposition. So, in a bit of a commentary, refinement, perhaps on what Jim has said about transcending radically the past, and your emphasis on the discontinuities of where we need to go with the history of Western civilization. All of that is very, very valid, and certainly a major part of the discussion. But I would like to say that also for me, hope requires a recognizing and a capitalizing on elements of our culture that point in the direction that we wish to go. That we transcend and include, to use Ken Wilber, our Chancellor's refrain. And I think you can see a lot of that continuity in Rachel Carson without denying the radical departure that you emphasize. She had this grounding in the Greek concept of hubris. This relates to Jen's remarks, I think. And she was steeped in English Romantic literature. The matriarchy, the resurgence of matriarchy that you're emphasizing, doesn't come out of nowhere. It also can be linked to developments in Western civilization over time, a progressive understanding of individual rights and how they apply to people beyond the role of white men, and leading to a concept of individual liberty that really is part of Western history and was developed in Western civilization. And the science, Rachel Carson does not call for an abandonment of the scientific approach, or for, in a sense, some control of nature. She's very positive about the advances that have been made over infectious diseases, for example, and she sees the need to have a more refined and more sophisticated science that really understands the cell biology and the interrelationships of systems, a scientific understanding of systems and ecology. So, and of course, too, you ended up pointing to the success of her life and the way she was honored by the mainstream society with the Kennedy Commission and so forth. So, my single point here is that there is, in addition to the transcending of the past that needs to come to that we need to point towards, the way towards that also demands an inclusion of much in our history. So I'll stop with that remark. And probably will that fit into your sense?
Yeah, well, I love the different perspectives that we have, and especially want to acknowledge the perspective on the chat, where there's this wonderful fermentation going on in our conversation. And so that brings us to the bottom of the hour and brings our discussion for a close. And so I want to encourage you, as you reread the book for next month, to follow some of what Georgie and Amy were doing. And that is taking these very specific wrestling that she was doing with the chemical industry and extracting out of that some of her timeless statements about our condition as humans within the subset of nature. So we can work into that and not get lost in the battles. Even as Jim Garrison said, the big thing about Achilles was maybe not his work as a warrior, but his transformation as a person. So we want to see Rachel not only as an activist involved with DDT and chlordane, but also to see what the major extractions of that are for our day. So,
Will, could I make one final little thing?
Sure.
Just everyone, this is so rich. I would just encourage, before we meet again next month, if you haven't seen The Color of Water.
The Shape of Water.
The Shape of Water. If you haven't seen The Shape of Water, that won the Academy Award for Best Film, Best Director, it is so exquisitely aligned with everything that Will is talking about. And it would be, I think, enriching for everyone to see that before we take up the actual text of Silent Spring.
That's a great suggestion. In fact, I'll bring The Shape of Water and Rachel Carson as a context for our discussion for next month.
Beautiful.
Well, this is a wonderful time together, and we'll gather again next month.
Bye, everyone.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.